The summer of 1944 brought with it a strange confidence inside Germany's armored corps. Despite the chaos on the Eastern Front and the Allied landings in Normandy, many Wehrmacht officers still believed that German engineering, refined, tested, and proven, could outmatch anything the Allies put on wheels or tracks. Their Tigers and Panthers were legends, symbols of invincibility. American tanks, they said, were toys, cheaply made, lightly armored, and hopelessly outclassed. Then came the reports of something new. Allied reconnaissance mentioned a fast-moving American vehicle that had been cutting through German positions in France. Something smaller than a tank, but far quicker than anything they'd seen before. At first, German intelligence dismissed it as exaggeration. But after several Panther units were struck by what they believed to be hit-and-run tank destroyers, curiosity and irritation grew. Orders came down from Berlin: capture one of these light vehicles intact. The engineers wanted to see it. That vehicle was the M18 Hellcat. When the Americans had first designed it, even their own generals were skeptical. It was lightly armored, almost fragile by European standards. But it was fast, unbelievably fast. On open roads, the Hellcat could reach to speeds over 50 miles per hour, faster than any tank of the war. It carried a 76mm gun, not the largest, but deadly accurate, especially at distance. American crews learned quickly to rely not on armor, but on speed, using the Hellcat like a phantom, appearing, striking, and vanishing before the enemy could react. In August 1944, near the ruins of Falaise, a German recovery team finally got what it wanted. Amid the wreckage of a destroyed column, they found a Hellcat that had thrown a track and been abandoned by its crew. Its hull was intact, its gun undamaged. The tank was loaded onto a flatbed and taken east, bound for a testing ground outside Kummersdorf, Germany's top research and weapons evaluation center. When it arrived, the engineers gathered around it like curious surgeons inspecting a patient. The American tank destroyer looked unimpressive next to their own heavy armor. Its armor plating was thin enough to pierce with a hammer, its frame built for speed rather than strength. They joked that it looked like a sports car pretending to be a tank. One officer quipped that it belonged in a racetrack, not a battlefield. The others laughed. They ran their tests, measuring, comparing, even taking it for a drive around the proving field. The vehicle's speed startled them. It turned quickly, accelerated like nothing they had. But to them, it seemed pointless. A tank destroyer that dies to machine gun fire, one engineer wrote in his notes. Typical of American overconfidence. They dismissed it as a curiosity, a fast coffin with a big gun. But that opinion would not last long. For while they laughed in their laboratories, reports from the Western Front began to tell a different story. Entire German armored units were being harassed by these same machines. Hellcats darting through hedgerows and villages, firing at Panthers before disappearing into the smoke. Crews spoke of shells that seemed to come from nowhere, of engines they could never catch. One Panther commander described the experience as being hunted by ghosts, and soon one of those ghosts would strike back at the men who had mocked it. The Hellcat that the Germans had captured sat inside a fenced compound at Kummersdorf, under guard and coated with a layer of dust. To most of the engineers, it was already yesterday's curiosity, a symbol of what they believed was the American obsession with mobility over protection. They ran their data, filed their reports, and went back to working on heavier, slower, and more complex designs. But one man among them, a young engineer named Dieter Hanke, could not stop thinking about it. He had been present during the test drives and had seen something his colleagues had ignored. It wasn't the Hellcat's speed that fascinated him. It was what that speed meant. The Americans, he realized, had built a weapon around a single principle: strike first, never be hit. It was a philosophy completely opposed to the German doctrine of brute strength and armor thickness. Hanke made quiet notes. He compared engine output, suspension weight ratios, and turret traverse speeds. The numbers disturbed him. The M18, light as it was, could outmaneuver even the latest German models by a factor of 3. He knew that meant one thing on the battlefield: the ability to choose the fight. The Americans, he muttered one night in the workshop, have built the future. Still, his warning went unheard. The senior officers mocked his fascination, insisting that no real tank could sacrifice protection for speed. They reminded him of the Tiger. Its thick armor, its devastating 88 millimeter gun, its reputation for invincibility. To them, the war would be won by power, not agility. But outside the laboratories, the war itself was already proving them wrong. In Normandy, the M18 Hellcats were performing miracles. Small units of American tank destroyers were ambushing columns of German armor, vanishing into orchards and villages before the slower panzers could respond. They worked in pairs, using their superior mobility to confuse and outflank the enemy. What they lacked in armor, they made up for with precision and nerve. Reports began reaching German command of heavy losses inflicted by what were described as light tanks. Commanders could not believe that such fragile vehicles were capable of destroying their Panthers and Tigers. Yet the facts were undeniable. Hellcats were showing up everywhere, on ridge lines behind hedgerows, appearing where no tank should be. In September 1944, a demonstration was organized at Kummersdorf for senior Wehrmacht officers. They wanted to prove once and for all that the Hellcat's success was exaggerated, that German armor still reigned supreme. Engineers restored the captured M18 to full working order. A firing range was prepared, with a decommissioned Panzer III placed as the target. The event was meant to be simple, show that the American gun was inferior, the armor laughably thin, the machine unfit for a real war. The officers gathered on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was pale, the wind sharp. The Hellcat was rolled into position beside a German Panther, the pride of their armored divisions. The contrast was stark, one sleek and light, the other massive and angular, its armor glinting in the sun. The crowd smirked at the sight. "Let us see how the toy performs," one of them muttered. The test began. The Panther fired first, its shell tearing through a steel target half a kilometer away. Applause followed. Then it was the Hellcat's turn. Its engine started with a roar, higher pitched than any German tank. The gunner took aim, fired, and the 76 millimeter round hit dead center, penetrating the Panzer III with surgical precision. Silence fell. It wasn't the power of the shot that stunned them. It was the speed. The gun had fired, reloaded, and fired again before most observers even realized. The Hellcat pivoted with ease, its turret swinging fast and smooth. Within seconds, it had fired 3 rounds into 3 different targets, each a direct hit. The laughter stopped. When the echo of the final shot faded, the German officers stood in silence. The thin, agile American machine before them had just done something their own armored behemoths could not. It had moved, aimed, and struck 3 targets in under 30 seconds. The engineers exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or embarrassed. The demonstration had not gone according to the intended script. The Hellcat crew, composed of German technicians under Hanke's supervision, climbed out of the vehicle, smoke still curling from its barrel. One officer broke the silence. "Fast," he said grudgingly, "but it would be destroyed before it could fire a second shot." The others nodded, eager to restore their wounded pride. But Hanke noticed something that the others didn't. The Hellcat's gunner had been smiling. The man, a veteran mechanic, whispered, "She's a ghost, sir. You can't catch what you can't see." That evening, the officers met in the briefing room to discuss the results. Charts and numbers filled the walls. They talked about armor thickness, shell penetration, fuel ratios, all the details that define German engineering. Yet Hanke spoke only once, and his words unsettled the room. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we build fortresses." The Americans built hunters outside the walls of Kummersdorf. The war was shifting rapidly. On the Western Front, Allied armored units were pushing through France, cutting deep into German lines. Reports came daily of encounters with Hellcats, swift ambushes that left burning Panthers in their wake. The speed of these tank destroyers was their deadliest weapon. They didn't wait for the enemy, they dictated the fight. In early October, one such engagement would become legend among the few German officers who survived to tell it. Near the town of Nancy, a German reconnaissance unit spotted what they believed to be an American convoy retreating. It was bait. Hidden along the ridge lines were 3 M18 Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. When the first German tank, a Panther, advanced, the Hellcats opened fire from nearly a mile away. Their shots struck in perfect sequence. The first shell disabled the lead tank, blocking the road. The second ignited the rear vehicle. The third slammed into the center of the column. The entire ambush lasted less than 90 seconds. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the Hellcats were gone, leaving only burning wrecks and confusion in their wake. Word of the ambush reached Kummersdorf within days. Some dismissed it as American propaganda, but Hanke knew better. He studied the reports, the photographs, and the impact data. Everything matched what he had seen in the tests: speed, precision, and tactical intelligence. He began writing a classified memo for the Armaments Ministry, warning that the Americans were mastering a new kind of warfare. He titled it simply, Doctrine of Mobility. His memo would never be read. The war was collapsing faster than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. By winter, the front lines were falling back toward the Reich's borders. Production of heavy tanks continued despite dwindling resources. The factories that could have adapted the lessons of the Hellcat were already under Allied bombardment. In the final weeks before his unit was evacuated, Hanke returned to the captured Hellcat one last time. It sat quietly in its hangar, its metal dull beneath the gray light. He placed a hand on its turret and whispered, "You were never meant to fight fair, were you?" He understood now that the Americans had not built a tank. They had built an idea, and soon that idea would strike first. Winter came to Germany in 1944 like a thief in the night, cold, gray, and merciless. The laughter that had once filled the testing grounds at Kummersdorf was gone. Allied bombers thundered overhead almost daily now, turning nearby cities into ruins. The engineers worked by lamplight, their breath visible in the freezing air, trying desperately to improve weapons that no longer mattered. The M18 Hellcat, once a captured curiosity, was now treated like a relic. Its engine had been drained, its gun locked, its hull covered by a tarp. But for those who had seen it in action, men like Dieter Henke, the machine had become a symbol of something larger. Everything the German war machine had failed to understand. In January 1945, a report arrived from the Western Front that made even the most stubborn officers uneasy. At Bastogne, during the Battle of the Bulge, small groups of American Hellcats had fought against German armor in the snow and fog, and won. The impossible had happened again. Light, paper-thin tank destroyers were outmaneuvering and destroying German tanks that should have outclassed them in every way. According to the field reports, the Hellcats didn't fight conventionally. They appeared, fired, and vanished before the heavier tanks could even adjust their turrets. Their speed let them relocate across the battlefield faster than any German crew could believe. Panther commanders radioed in frustration that they were fighting phantoms. At Kummersdorf, the engineers replayed the reports in disbelief. "It's impossible," one said. "Physics doesn't allow for such movement on this terrain." But Hanke only smiled faintly. He knew exactly how it was possible, because he had driven it. The Hellcat's suspension, its torque, its thin armor, all of it sacrificed protection for velocity. It was not designed to survive hits. It was designed to make sure it never got hit at all. As the winter dragged on, the Reich's engineers began experimenting desperately. Orders came from Berlin to find ways to make their tanks lighter, faster, more mobile. But it was too late. Their designs were tied to doctrines that had already failed. They built monsters of steel, slow, massive, and fuel-hungry, while the Americans and Soviets were building predators. Hanke's reports were buried in bureaucratic confusion, but his fascination didn't fade. In late February, during a brief lull in the bombings, he convinced a few junior officers to reactivate the captured Hellcat for one last test. This time against a live target. A disabled Panther was towed onto the range. The Hellcat was fueled, its gun inspected, and its engine roared back to life with a sharp, high whine. The test was simple. They wanted to measure how quickly the American tank destroyer could acquire, aim, and fire compared to German armor. Hanke took the gunner's seat himself. The range was set at 800 meters, a fair distance for both vehicles. When the order was given, the stopwatch started. The Hellcat pivoted, locked on, and fired. The shell struck the Panther's turret ring. A perfect hit. Time elapsed. 9 seconds. A murmur ran through the observers. Hanke adjusted, fired again. The second round hit precisely through the same hole. Time, 16 seconds. The German officers stared. The Panther, even in perfect working condition, could not have aimed and fired twice in that time. Its massive turret was too slow, its gun too heavy. The realization sank in. The Hellcat didn't just move faster, it thought faster. Its crew could react and reposition before their opponents could even process what was happening. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the engine idled softly in the cold air, a heartbeat in the silence. Then one officer said quietly, almost bitterly, "Perhaps that's why we're losing." Hunk shut off the engine. The laughter that had once filled the testing grounds was gone, replaced by the low hum of a truth no one wanted to say aloud. Speed had beaten strength. By March 1945, the war had turned into a slow collapse. The front lines were breaking apart under the weight of Allied firepower. Cities burned, bridges vanished overnight. What had once been the heart of the German war machine was now a patchwork of shattered roads, stranded convoys, and exhausted men. Even in Kummersdorf, where the best engineers once debated ideas of perfection, the sound of artillery could now be heard from the west. The M18 Hellcat remained in its hangar, its once polished surfaces now dulled by soot and dust. But it was still functional, the one machine in the compound that could start instantly, no matter the cold. The Panther tanks beside it needed teams of mechanics to coax their engines to life, but the Hellcat's motor purred the moment Hanky turned the key. He found himself testing it secretly at night, circling the perimeter of the proving ground under blackout conditions. Every time he felt the wind rush against his face through the open turret, he understood the Americans a little better. The engineers who remained at Kummersdorf no longer mocked the captured vehicle. They studied it in silence now, realizing that they were witnessing a design philosophy that had outpaced their own. Mobility over mass, Hanke wrote in his final notes. It is not armor that wins a war, but the ability to strike before the enemy reacts. That truth arrived violently on the front lines. Across the Rhine, American armored divisions were cutting through Germany faster than anyone had imagined. Among them were dozens of Hellcats, fast, loud, fearless. In ambushes and town battles alike, they darted through rubble-strewn streets, engaging heavy German tanks at impossible angles, disappearing before return fire could find them. One such engagement would become infamous among surviving German tank crews. Near Remagen, an armored platoon of Panthers attempted to retake a river crossing. They were ambushed by a group of M18 Hellcats lying in wait behind the ruins of a factory. The Americans struck first, always first. Their 76mm guns found weak points in the Panthers' armor, striking their flanks with pinpoint precision. Within minutes, the German counterattack was over. The survivors reported something strange. They never saw where the shots came from. The enemy's speed was disorienting. One moment the tanks were there, the next they were gone, replaced by smoke and silence. "We fired at ghosts," one gunner wrote afterward. When word of the defeat reached Kummersdorf, even the most loyal engineers fell silent. Their superiors still spoke of secret weapons and miracle turnarounds, but those in the laboratories knew the truth. There was no miracle coming. The Reich's obsession with armor thickness and firepower had created perfect weapons for the previous war, not the one they were fighting now. In the weeks that followed, Kummersdorf itself came under threat. Allied columns were moving fast, their reconnaissance units reaching deeper into Germany than anyone thought possible. Rumors spread that American forces might capture the testing facility intact. Orders came to destroy all equipment before it fell into enemy hands. But Hanke couldn't bring himself to destroy the Hellcat. To him, it represented something beyond national pride or ideology. It was proof that innovation didn't belong to a flag. It belonged to the minds that understood the battlefield. Those who saw war not as a contest of strength, but of speed, intellect, and adaptability. On a cold morning in April, as the sound of distant tanks grew louder, he made his choice. He fueled the Hellcat one last time, the engine roaring to life with that same defiant growl. The other engineers watched in silence as he drove it out of the hangar, across the proving ground, and into the mist beyond the fences. He didn't look back. He knew that the laughter, the arrogance, and the faith in indestructibility had all died long before this moment. The machine beneath him, born in another country, built by another army, had outlived them all. The roads south of Berlin were clogged with chaos. Convoys of refugees, retreating soldiers, and abandoned vehicles stretching for miles. Smoke hung low over the horizon, the smell of fuel and ash mixing with the damp chill of early spring. Through it all moved a single machine that seemed out of place among the wreckage. The American M18 Hellcat, its engine growling softly beneath a gray sky. Dieter Hanke drove with steady hands, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The irony wasn't lost on him. A German engineer fleeing through the ruins of his own country in a captured American tank destroyer. The same machine that his superiors had mocked, the same one that had embarrassed their most prized designs, now carried him through the final days of a dying empire. Every few kilometers, he passed what was left of German strength. Panthers with shattered tracks, half buried in mud. Tigers burned black and skeletal by the roadside. Trucks stripped bare by desperate civilians. The once mighty columns of armor that had rolled so confidently across Europe were now nothing but rusting carcasses. Hanke slowed each time he passed one, glancing at the destroyed turrets and twisted barrels, and thought of how his country had misunderstood the future. He stopped briefly in a small village that had been abandoned days earlier. The church bell tower was cracked, its bell hanging silent. He parked the Hellcat in the center square, climbed out, and sat on its hull listening. The sound of distant artillery rolled faintly through the hills. He took out a worn notebook, his design journal, and wrote his final entry. "Speed is thought," he wrote. "In war as in nature, survival belongs to the one who adapts first. We built monuments. The Americans built momentum." By the time he finished writing, the sun was low, a pale disk behind clouds of smoke. He climbed back inside and turned the key. The Hellcat's engine came to life instantly, smooth and eager. Even after months in storage and years of war, it purred like something new. He smiled faintly. "You don't belong in this world either," he said under his breath. As he continued south, he began to hear reports over the radio, fragments of news breaking through static. American forces were crossing the Elbe. Soviet units were closing in from the east. Germany was collapsing from both sides. The Third Reich, the empire that had once promised 1,000 years, was now measured in days. Near evening, Hanke encountered a column of German soldiers marching on foot, their uniforms caked with mud, their faces hollow. They froze when they saw the tank destroyer approaching, its white Allied star still visible beneath the grime. For a moment, they raised their weapons. But when Hanke opened the hatch and called out in German, they lowered them slowly. An officer approached, suspicion on his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing at the machine. Hanke hesitated, then answered simply, "From the future." The officer said nothing more. He saluted half-heartedly and waved the column onward. Hanke stayed by the roadside until they disappeared into the mist, a line of broken men heading nowhere. Then he turned the Hellcat west, toward the sound of American artillery. As night fell, he crossed a river where a bridge had been blown apart. Using the Hellcat's speed, he leapt the gap across a damaged span of girders, the treads slamming down on the opposite bank. The shock threw him forward, but the machine held. Its suspension absorbed the blow effortlessly. Even now, in the dying months of the war, it still felt alive. By dawn, he could see the first American patrols, cautious, alert, weapons raised. He slowed, raising his hands above the turret. The Hellcat rolled to a stop on the edge of a forest clearing. The soldiers circled it, disbelief on their faces as they saw the German uniform inside an American machine. One of them finally asked, "Where the hell did you get that?" Hank only replied, "It's yours." And you were right to laugh last. The American soldiers who surrounded the Hellcat didn't know what to make of it. The machine looked as though it had driven straight out of a nightmare, streaked with ash and mud, its tracks coated in frost, its white star barely visible beneath grime. The man inside, however, wasn't one of theirs. He was a German, his uniform stripped of insignia, his face pale from exhaustion and smoke. At first, they thought it was a trick. They ordered him out at gunpoint, hands raised, while one of them climbed inside to check for explosives. But when the engine continued to idle with that smooth, confident hum, so unlike the coughing rattle of German tanks, curiosity began to outweigh suspicion. The American lieutenant who arrived shortly after listened quietly as Hanke explained, in broken English, that the vehicle had been captured months earlier for testing. "You stole it from us," the lieutenant said with a wry smile. Hankett nodded. "And it taught us more than we ever taught it." They brought him to the rear lines, past convoys of jeeps and Shermans rumbling east. Everywhere he looked, Hanke saw what his own army had failed to grasp: coordination, flexibility, movement. The Americans were not chained to heavy doctrines or machines of prestige. They built for the battlefield, not the parade ground. And everywhere he saw them, the M18s were there too, darting along roads, pausing at intersections, their crews relaxed but alert. Hunters, not fortresses. When word of the German engineer with the Hellcat reached an intelligence officer at headquarters, Hunke was sent to a temporary camp near Kassel for interrogation. But his interrogators found him unusually cooperative. He handed over his notebooks, sketches, and reports from Kummersdorf without hesitation. "Everything I warned them about is in there," he said simply. "You were already winning before your tanks even reached the front." The officer leafed through the pages, pausing at Hankey's final note. "Speed is thought." It was underlined twice. Meanwhile, the captured Hellcat was examined by American mechanics who could scarcely believe its condition. Despite months of German use and neglect, it started flawlessly, fired accurately, and handled as though fresh from the factory floor. "She's tougher than she looks," one sergeant said, patting its side affectionately. When he learned the Germans had tested it at their proving grounds and dismissed it, he laughed out loud. Guess they didn't test it while it was shooting back. Within weeks, the war in Europe was drawing to its inevitable close. Berlin was surrounded. The Third Reich was collapsing under its own weight. Hanke watched it all from behind American lines, a prisoner not of punishment, but of irony. The empire that had built the most feared tanks in the world had been undone by a lighter, faster, more adaptable enemy, and by the arrogance that had refused to see it coming. As Allied armor thundered east toward victory, Hanke's captured Hellcat was quietly shipped back to an American depot for analysis. Technicians inspected the modifications the Germans had made, none of them significant. The truth was simple. They hadn't improved it because they couldn't. The design had been complete from the start. Elegant, efficient, and practical. It had no need for reinvention. In his final days at the camp, Hanke was given a chance to speak with one of the American tank destroyer officers who had fought in France. They stood together by a fence overlooking a column of Shermans and Hellcats heading toward the Elbe. "You built beautiful machines," the officer said respectfully, "but they were too heavy to chase the war." Hanke nodded, "and too proud to learn from it." The two men shook hands, soldiers and engineers from opposite sides of a conflict that had consumed the world. Behind them, the line of Hellcats rolled steadily into the distance, their engines purring like predators. Each one carried the lesson that had taken the world's most fearsome army years, and its defeat to understand. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world exhaled. But among the ruins, the lessons of its downfall began to crystallize. Across the broken roads and empty fields of Europe, the wrecks of war still smoldered. Tigers, Panthers, and countless other machines once thought invincible now stood silent, their hulks twisted by fire and time. Yet among all the armor left behind, one vehicle type remained curiously absent from the graveyards: the M18 Hellcat. Unlike the steel giants that rusted where they fell, the Hellcats rarely died where they fought. They moved too quickly, struck too precisely, and escaped before the battlefield could swallow them. To the engineers who studied the aftermath of the war, that fact was telling. In the end, speed had survived where strength had failed. In the weeks following Germany's capitulation, Allied technical teams combed through research centers like Kummersdorf. They found the ruins of laboratories, burned files, half-built prototypes, and in one forgotten hangar, a small collection of vehicles set aside for study. Among them sat the captured Hellcat that Hanke had once driven. Dust coated its hull, and the word Beute, German for trophy, was faintly stenciled across its side. The Americans who recovered it recognized it immediately. They laughed, shaking their heads. "She made it home after all," one of them said. The machine was loaded onto a transport truck and sent west toward Frankfurt. Along the way, soldiers and civilians alike turned to stare as the strange hybrid rolled by, an American design carrying the scars of German hands. It was as if the two halves of the war, The aggressor and the defender had merged into one quiet symbol of survival. Meanwhile, in an American field office outside Kassel, Dieter Hanke was still being debriefed. His insights had drawn the attention of U.S. ordnance officers and even a few industrial specialists. They wanted to know what the Germans had learned from their captured vehicles, what doctrines they had misunderstood, and what they had feared most. Hanke answered truthfully. "We feared what we couldn't predict," he explained. "The Hellcat could be anywhere at any time. It was not a tank, it was a decision. Fast, precise, confident. You couldn't plan against it." His captors were surprised by his candor. When they asked him what the Germans had thought of the machine when they first tested it, he smiled faintly. "We laughed," he said. "We thought it was fragile. A mistake." Then his expression darkened. "We didn't realize that the mistake was ours." By midsummer, the captured Hellcat had been cleaned, inspected, and quietly put on display for Allied officers in Frankfurt. It bore no flag, no markings beyond its original serial number. A small brass plaque beneath it read simply, "Captured at Kummersdorf, reclaimed May 1945. Those who stood before it saw more than a weapon. They saw a philosophy, one that had reshaped the nature of war itself. To the untrained eye, it was just another tank destroyer. To the men who understood, it was proof that innovation wasn't measured in weight or thickness, but in vision. The M18 had done what few weapons in history could. It changed how men thought about battle. Far away, Hanke's future was uncertain. He was neither celebrated nor condemned. Like many engineers of his generation, he was absorbed into the reconstruction efforts that followed the war, his past quietly rewritten in the bureaucracies of a divided Germany. But the lessons he carried from Kummersdorf, from the laughter that turned to silence, stayed with him forever. He once wrote to an American officer, years later, after the war, "The Hellcat was not simply a machine. It was a reminder that sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the quickest to learn." That line would later appear in a military journal, cited without attribution, as a closing reflection on the war's final truth. In the months after the war's end, Europe became a museum of wreckage. Everywhere, steel carcasses rusted in the rain, tigers sprawled like dead beasts in forests, panthers split open along roadsides, their great guns pointing at nothing. The world had seen the might of German engineering, but now it saw its limits. And yet one vehicle seemed to defy that image. The M18 Hellcat, the same machine the Germans had mocked and misunderstood, rolled through the post-war testing grounds of Allied Europe in near-perfect condition. Mechanics called it the Survivor. It had no battle scars beyond scratches and faded paint, no cracks in its turret, no weakness in its drive. Even after years of combat, its spirit remained intact. At a proving ground outside Paris, Allied officers gathered to study the lessons of the war. American and British engineers inspected captured German tanks side by side with their own machines, comparing weight, armor, range, and reliability. The difference was striking. The German tanks were masterpieces of precision engineering, but they were too heavy, too complicated, too fragile in the field. The Hellcat, by contrast, was simple, efficient, and fast. The embodiment of practicality over perfection. One officer, a veteran from the Ardennes, summarized it best. "The Germans built cathedrals. We built hammers." Meanwhile, back in Germany, Dieter Hanke lived quietly under a new identity. The war crimes tribunals ignored men like him. Technicians who had served without ideology, who built machines rather than propaganda. He worked briefly with reconstruction teams repairing bridges and power plants. Sometimes when he passed a scrapyard filled with burned-out tanks, he stopped and stared for long minutes. He could still hear the laughter of that first day at Kummersdorf, when the engineers had surrounded the captured Hellcat and called it a toy. He knew now that they hadn't been laughing at the machine. They had been laughing at what they couldn't understand. In late 1946, Hanke received a letter from an American colonel he had met during his interrogation. Inside was a single black and white photograph, the captured Hellcat at the Frankfurt depot, restored, its hull cleaned, its gun polished. Below it was a short note. "She still runs." You were right, Hanke kept the photo for the rest of his life. He never wrote back, but he framed it above his desk, where he worked on civilian engines and agricultural machines in the years that followed. He once told a coworker that the war had been a teacher, cruel but clear. "We learned too late," he said softly. "The battlefield belongs to the one who adapts first." As the years passed, the Hellcat faded from headlines and history books. New wars brought new machines, new doctrines. But among military historians, the M18 remained a quiet legend, the fastest armored vehicle of the Second World War, the machine that proved agility could defeat armor, that intelligence could outpace brute force. When Kummersdorf was finally reopened in the 1960s for research under the new German government, archaeologists found fragments of reports, sketches, and test logs. Among them was Hanke's handwritten note, stained and yellowed but legible. "They laughed until it struck first." That phrase became the unofficial motto of a generation of engineers who studied the war. A reminder that arrogance kills innovation faster than any enemy shell. By then, the Hellcat that had taught that lesson was already retired, its final service completed. It sat in a U.S. Army museum, restored to its wartime markings, its 76mm gun pointed proudly toward the horizon. Children climbed on it during tours, unaware that they were touching a survivor of the most brutal proving ground in history. For the veterans who passed by, though, the sight of that small, swift machine stirred something deeper: respect. It wasn't the biggest or strongest, but it had outlived them all. Decades after the war, long after the echoes of battle had faded and the empires of the 20th century had turned to memory, the M18 Hellcat still stood. Not in ruins, not forgotten, but preserved in quiet reverence. Its tracks, now cold and still, rested beneath museum lights that glowed faintly like dawn breaking over a battlefield. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Veterans paused and stared in silence. The placard beside it read simply, "M18 Hellcat. Speed is thought." The world had changed, but the lesson had not. Engineers from across nations, former enemies now bound by peace, came to study the machine that once embarrassed the might of German steel. They measured its lines, its simplicity, its balance of power and motion. There was nothing extravagant about it, nothing ornamental. Every curve, every bolt, every component had purpose. It was, as one designer put it, a weapon stripped of ego. In the archives of post-war research, the Hellcat's legacy became part of every armored doctrine that followed. The Cold War armies learned from its philosophy that speed and precision win the day, not sheer mass. The U.S. Army's later vehicles, the lightweight reconnaissance tanks, the self-propelled guns, even early prototypes of modern armored fighting vehicles, all carried something of its DNA. The idea that had once made German engineers laugh became the foundation of modern warfare. Dieter Henke lived to see it all. By the 1960s, he was a quiet man in his 50s, working in a design bureau that built machinery for West Germany's new civilian industries. He rarely spoke of the war, but every year on the anniversary of Germany's surrender, he took a long walk outside the city to a quiet hillside overlooking the Rhine. There he'd sit with his notebook, the same one he'd used at Kummersdorf, its pages worn and yellowed. Inside, the final entry remained untouched since 1945. Speed is thought. When he died in 1972, that notebook was found beside him, along with a photograph of the captured Hellcat sent to him decades earlier. His family donated both to a museum in Koblenz, where they were placed in an exhibit on wartime innovation. Visitors often stopped to read his final line, struck by how a single phrase could so perfectly define an entire generation's failure and redemption. And far away in an American military museum, the very same Hellcat that had once been tested by German hands stood quietly among the relics of the past. Its armor bore faint scars from battle, its paint restored but not renewed. A deliberate choice by the curators. They wanted the world to see it as it was, imperfect, but alive with purpose. Every so often, a historian would pause before it and smile, recalling the story of the German engineers who had once laughed at it, only to watch their own tanks burn in the snows of France and the fields of the Ardennes. They would whisper the line now etched into the plaque beneath the gun barrel. They laughed until it struck first. And in that silence, between the weight of memory and the hum of progress, the M18 Hellcat still seemed to breathe. not as a relic of war, but as a testament to a truth humanity keeps rediscovering, that in every struggle, the edge belongs not to the strongest, but to the swift, the daring, the ones who see beyond the armor and into the movement of tomorrow. The laughter of 1944 had long since faded, but the echo of that first strike, the one that silenced doubt, rewrote doctrine, and humbled pride, still rolled across history like distant thunder. Because speed, as Honke had written, is thought, and thought, when it moves first, always wins. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.